We are the World Adaptation Science Program, and this is the session for operationalizing adaptation effectiveness and strengthen finance for achieve the global goal on the adaptation. We will have 3 excellent presentations, and before that, allow me to have a very short introduction of the WASP, the World Adaptation Science Program, and this WASP was co-organized by 8 UN organizations: the UNFCCC, the WMO, UNEP, IPCC, GCM, and the United Nations universities, and we now have a new organization, UN organization, UNESCO. So we are going to deliver important adaptation science and to fill in the science and the policy science knowledge gaps. And today we are going to have 3 presentations. The first presentation was, will be presented by Prabhakar. Sorry for, excuse me for a while. I think I did some problem with my, okay. And I will have a short introduction of Prabhakar. He's from Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, and he is the co-chair of Policy and Finance Committee of WASP. Dr. Prabhakar works as a principal policy researcher at IGS Japan, and his research interests are vulnerability assessment, transboundary climate risks, loss and damage, and mainstreaming CCA and DR into development plans and policies, risk insurance, adaptation metrics, adaptive policies and institutions. And he is the lead author of UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, UNEP GEO, Global Environmental Outlook, and the contributing authors of IPCC assessment reports. He also he will give us a presentation on adaptation effectiveness. Now the floor is yours, Prabhakar.
Thank you very much, Minpeng, for your kind introduction. I'll share my screen. So as introduced by Minpeng, I'll be talking about how can we advance the adaptation effectiveness in our policies and actions. That's going to be the topic of my presentation today. And we are given 15 minutes roughly to each of us. So I'll try to stick to the time allocated to me. My presentation will heavily draw from the World Adaptation Science Program, Science for Policy, policy brief, which is drafted by several authors, and I'm just one of them. So please take this as a part or a full of viewpoint of all the authors of this particular policy brief. So if you look at the topic of adaptation effectiveness, in general, we characterize adaptation effectiveness as the extent to which the policies and actions can reduce the present and future climate risks. So here there are 2 dimensions. One is about the current risk, as well as the second one is the future risk. That means that either we know the policies and actions work to a certain extent, or we know to what extent they may not work currently or in the future. So that's a part of the definition of the adaptation effectiveness. And because the adaptation effectiveness is has been worked upon by many scholars from various fields, it tends to have a broad range of definitions. And I will give you the other end of the extent to which the adaptation effectiveness has been defined is that it has also been linked to the mitigation. That means that because adaptation is not working in isolation, because it is very much linked with the extent we achieve the mitigation levels. Hence, the adaptation effectiveness has also been defined as something increasing in a linear or concave fashion as that of the mitigation level. So this is on the one other end of the spectrum. The second thing that we need to look into when we talk about the adaptation effectiveness is that it is not a singular or unity concept, but it is more of a systems concept. It takes a lot of things into consideration. First of all, we need to understand that adaptation effectiveness is a unit, it has a unit of measurement, whether it is a qualitative or quantitative, and also it needs to be expressed in some kind of value terms, either comparing to the baseline or comparing to the goal that we have set. So that means that it doesn't operate in isolation and it has a certain baseline, either it is a fixed or it is a shifting baseline over the time period, or it also can benefit from having a goal, because goal provides us a particular ambition level. It also provides us a certain amount of the direction. And finally, we can also see that adaptation effectiveness is not given. It is highly affected by various enabling conditions. For example, we keep quoting about equity, justice, and fairness. Now, equity, justice, and fairness are large societal problems, and even in the most developed countries and the least developed countries, socially, the equity and justice and fairness is still a aim to be achieved. We have not yet achieved across the board, across the different developmental contexts. That means that having equity, justice, and fairness both as a prerequisite conditions as well as they need to be met within a particular project or programmatic condition makes this a very necessary component of the adaptation effectiveness discourse. Now, as I said, the adaptation effectiveness has a certain as much of the history as adaptation itself, because we have been implementing in a systematic manner adaptation since 2011, and more or less less systematic level, for the last 30 years or so. So that means that we have made certain progress in various components or various dimensions or various prerequisites of the adaptation effectiveness. For example, over the years, because of the continued support by various international, national, and regional stakeholders, a large capacity has been accumulated among the project implementation entities about how we effectively plan a particular project, setting the goal, objectives, blah, blah, blah. So that's a very much capacity has been well developed in that particular area. The second area that adaptation effectiveness or adaptation progress that we have seen that relates to the adaptation effectiveness is the stakeholder engagement. We see that more than any developmental area, the adaptation or climate change in general has brought a broad range of the stakeholder engagement in the implementation of the projects, programs, and plans, which is a very good development towards adaptation effectiveness. Thirdly, we see that monitoring and evaluation has been well developed in many development organizations, local NGOs or regional or international, and they are very well versed with ex-ante and ex-post evaluation, indicators, and things like that. So how do we quantify indicators, and even how do we actually come up with indices, a composite indices, and how do we understand them? So all these particular development over the last 30 years sets us in a very good stage to take forward the adaptation effectiveness to a next level. Now, coming to the recent developments, for example, if you look at the COP28, the adaptation, the word effectiveness has been used sparingly, probably to a certain extent. Only we see my review suggests that only 11 times the word effectiveness has been used, both in the context of the mitigation as well as adaptation. And in particular, the effectiveness word has been used in relation to participatory monitoring, more so in terms of the financial management, and to certain extent in terms of the efficiency, adequacy, and the scale of the projects that are being implemented, both in adaptation as well as mitigation. So that is a level of the emphasis that is being given within the COP outcomes, which is the recent outcome, which will give you a particular idea of where we stand in terms of the global negotiations. And we also need to note that in the global stocktake, the lack of progress in the adaptation effectiveness, both in terms of the collective assessment as well as in the monitoring and evaluation, has received a good attention. So that's very good. So that is where the larger context and the progress so far in terms of the adaptation effectiveness. Now we can pinpoint or pin the adaptation effectiveness discourse in the two contexts. One is at the project level, the other one is beyond the project, that means a programmatic or regional, or at the larger than the region level. Now, at the project level, if you look at the diagram here, it shows that the project cycle or a adaptation planning cycle, which can be divided into roughly two halves. One half is about assessing the risks and vulnerabilities and capacities. The other half is about reducing the risks. Now, where can we go wrong so that the effectiveness of the adaptation program or project can be faltered? So the areas are, for example, probably the problem that we are pursuing is not at all adaptation problem. It is a problem somewhere lying somewhere else, but probably we are wrongly understanding the problem, and hence we are defining within the context of the adaptation. So that is a very big problem itself to begin with. So we want to avoid that one. So how do we define our objectives relating to adaptation and effectiveness, situating there is need to be very carefully considered. Not every problem is a climate change problem, and hence not every problem need to be seen as an adaptation problem. The second important area where we could go wrong is in our evaluation of the risk, vulnerability, and capacity assessments. Now, there are a lot of tools that have been developed, which are simulation, dynamic tools, and qualitative and quantitative assessment tools are available. The problem with the good thing about these tools is they are very easy to use and simplifies the process for many stakeholders. But it also gives the problem, because of the simplification of the process, many stakeholders blindly follow these tools. They don't understand what the results that they are getting, whether the results they are getting is because of the data problems, or what are the data limitations. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong in use of these tools, and also the quality of the data and things like that. So there's a lot of area where we can improve that. Thirdly, moving from one half of the adaptation planning to the other of the adaptation planning is linking these assessments to the identification of the appropriate practices and policies. There's a large gap here, and we are yet to overcome this particular gap. And finally, the final problem I see here is the monitoring and evaluation. That means that it's like a lot of blind people in a room are trying to touch different parts of the elephant. It's a very old adage, and it applies to here as well. Do we really know that what we are measuring and evaluating is what we want to evaluate and measure? So ultimately, it relates to whether the indicators and everything that we have identified, are they capturing the essence of the adaptation or not? So that is where we are in terms of the limitation. So that is at the project level. Now let us zoom out to the little bit higher level. Now a project has been implemented at a particular location. Maybe the project was implemented for 2 years or 3 years, and then we have a gap of 2 years, 3 years, and then another donor comes, and then they say, oh, the last project has only achieved this much, and we need to implement another project. That means that in the same location, we are trying to implement a similar project after certain years. So that means that our baseline conditions have shifted, and also the context within which the adaptation project has to be implemented has shifted, both because of the previous project as well as because of the larger context, the developmental, socio-economic, international context have changed. That affects the second project as well. So whatever the ex-post evaluation that we did in the previous project may not hold good for the next project. That's one thing that we have to capture. The second thing is probably there's a gamut or a what you call a hodgepodge of the projects implemented in a given location in the phase 1, but in the phase 2 we are trying to combine all these areas into a single project. So what I mean to say is convey here is adaptation projects and programs, they are implemented in a very complex circumstances. So how do we accumulate these individual project outcomes or program outcomes to a multi-level and accumulating at the higher scales is something we have not yet tried out. So this is where we also need to make a progress. And the second aspect of the adaptation effectiveness brings the complexity is that it is not just sufficient that we just reduce the vulnerability and reduce the risk, but increase the capacity. But we are being told that we need to aim for certain level of ambition, and we also need to look into the feasibility aspects of the programs and projects, and we need to ensure the equity and fairness and justice elements as well. Now, if you look at these, a lot of these elements they appear to be very important for adaptation effectiveness, but probably looking at the different scales of the projects that implement, probably some of these elements will provide challenge to the implementers. Take the simple example of the equity and fairness and justice elements. As I said earlier, these are very much entrenched within the social political systems of a country or society, and they may not be probably be effectively addressed within the project context of adaptation. That means that we need to actually have larger solutions for these problems, but we need to also link the adaptation plans and programs and projects to those particular larger whatever the procedures or whatever the intervention the governments bring in to improve the equity and justice elements. So it's not something that can be achieved within a particular adaptation project cycle itself. So we need to keep that particular element in view. So because of this complexity, we see that various levels of the adaptation effectiveness is possible. Of course, we want to make sure that ambition, feasibility, equity, and justice are highest possible extent. But we don't know to what extent we can live without some of these. For example, to what extent we can give away the equity and justice element, but still achieve the highest effectiveness of the adaptation project or program. Because we don't have that particular metric at hand, we see that a certain amount of what we call factors, law of factors, limiting factors applies here. That means that any element which is not being provided it at a required amount, it would bring down the overall effectiveness of the projects. So that is how we try to understand how these different elements of components of the adaptation effectiveness work together in a particular project context. The other complex element is adaptation metrics. We see that the metrics of the adaptation effectiveness can be very much location specific, and they can also be very much location specific to sector. For example, the metrics in agriculture or urban areas, as well as biodiversity. I have one more minute. Sorry, I'll finish it fast. May not be portable to each of these sectors. So how do we actually come up with the metrics that are compatible with the different contexts or sectors is also the thing that we need to look into. So ultimately, given all these challenges, what we have come up with the recommendation is that at the international level, we need to have systems in place that provides certain amount of the guidance, tools, and for assessment and methods to the stakeholders at the national and subnational level. That's one thing. And of course, we have seen that there is a development in terms of the global goal that will also enhance the discourse on how do we put the adaptation effectiveness directed towards the goal that have been set. That's very good development. The secondly, at the national level, we need policies and plans to work towards this adaptation effectiveness. For example, we expect the countries to identify national specific indicators or even sector specific indicators. And in terms of the specific actions, we want to look at how do we constantly improve our data collection methods, data quality, risk and vulnerability assessment tools, and all those things that needs to be taken up over the time period. So I will stop here, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhakar. And before I give the floor to Henry, I will open one very quick question for Prabhakar. And anyone who wants to ask a question, please introduce yourself first. Any question for Prabhakar's presentation? Okay. If there is no quick question for Prabhakar, we are going to give the floor to Henry Neufeld. He's from UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, and he is the head of impact assessment and adaptation at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. He currently leads the UNEP climate work on climate risk and transparency in adaptation, and is the chief scientific editor of the UNEP Adaptation Gap Reports. He was also a lead author on the Working Group 2 chapter on food fibers and ecosystem products of the recently launched IPCC 6th Assessment Report. He has more than 20 years of experiences in international research for development and policy advice on climate change mitigation and adaptation, focusing on natural resources management, agriculture and forestry, food security, and the bioeconomy. Now he is going to share with us the latest findings on adaptation finance of Adaptation Gap Report in 2023. Now the floor is yours, Henry.
Yes, thank you, Minpeng. Can you see the screen with the red burning house and everything? Good. Okay. I'll start by giving you a quick recap of the findings of last year's adaptation gap report before going more into depth with the adaptation finance. So let me see if I can just move this. Okay, so last year saw the hottest summer on record globally by a large margin, unprecedented flooding in China, extreme heat, wildfires in Canada and the US, and the continuation of a multi-year drought in East Africa, among others. So evidence is clear that climate impacts are rising and are increasingly translating into limits to adaptation, some of which may have already been reached. To protect vulnerable populations and avoid increasing losses and damages, we must therefore urgently ramp up adaptation efforts alongside rapid cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. In the context of these growing climate risks, the GAP report provides science-based assessments of the global progress in adaptation to inform international climate change discussions under the UNFCCC. And last year's report shows why adaptation is slowing on all fronts when it should be accelerating to catch up with climate impacts. As you can see from the upper figure, progress in adaptation planning is plateauing. While 5 out of 6 countries now have at least one national adaptation planning instrument, progress to reach full global coverage is slowing and requires greater support. On the other hand, over half of countries have 2 or more national level instruments, and their quality is improving in terms of adequacy and effectiveness. The lower figure shows that while projects are getting bigger in volume, the number of adaptation actions supported through the 4 international climate funds has stagnated for the past decade. The report also found that gender and social inclusion is poorly addressed and funded in national adaptation actions despite showing better results. Since adaptation implementation in developing countries largely depends on external financial support, failure to enhance the number of adaptation actions will increase the implementation gap. As a result of the decision made at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh to establish a fund and funding arrangements for loss and damage, this last year's report also specifically focused on loss and damage to support parties in the negotiations during COP28. A recent study indicated that the 55 most climate vulnerable economies alone have already experienced losses and damages of more than $500 billion in the past 2 decades. These costs will rise steeply in the coming decades, particularly in the absence of strong mitigation and adaptation, which are by far the best ways to limit losses and damages. As the figure shows, the report identifies multiple ways of addressing the residual risks before, during, and after climate change events, and including economic and non-economic loss and damage. But many uncertainties remain regarding the financial needs to address loss and damage, and this requires urgent attention. While the new loss and damage fund will be central to mobilizing resources, other innovative funding sources must be found to reach the necessary scale. So now I'll talk a little bit more about the adaptation finance gap. And the way we define the adaptation finance gap is the difference between the needs, that is estimated costs of adaptation, costs and needs determined by the countries themselves, and what the current the international adaptation finance flows is showing us. And it also shows that it depends on the expected climate change, that is what we have to adapt to. And as climate is changing, adaptation costs are rising. And the report always focuses on developing countries because we tend to have much better information on developing countries than on developed countries. And that is because we draw the information mainly from the OECD database, and that is populated by donor countries reporting themselves. What you can see is that adaptation cost estimates, or needs rather, are up to 387 billion per year, between 215 and 387 billion per year for this decade. And this is a significant increase compared to the last report, which was 170 to 340 billion, based on the report that we produced in 2016 and updated by current prices. And you can see also in the figure ups that in terms of the actual costs, you know, the low income countries have the lowest adaptation costs compared to middle income countries and upper middle and high income countries. But if you turn it around and base it on a GDP base, which is the right-hand side, you can see that low-income countries have the highest proportion of losses and damages connected to adaptation and adaptation costs compared to the other income brackets. That's because, you know, they're much poorer and therefore have to spend much greater amounts of their income on adaptation to address these climate risks. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the report also broke down the adaptation costs by different sectors, you know, biodiversity, early warning, health, fisheries, agriculture, infrastructure, flooding, and coastal, and that there are, you know, major costs primarily through coastal and flooding, and also infrastructure that we can see here. So as I already explained, the gap is defined by the difference between costs and needs on the one hand side, and then adaptation flows on the other. And as you can see, the gap is enormous. You know, it's basically 10 to 18 times the needs and costs. That's only 5 to 10% of what is needed for adaptation per year for this decade. So if you think in comparison to what was made available during the global financial crisis, you know, these numbers, while they look large, they're actually quite small and could be managed easily. But I also need to address the fact that the finance flows that we measure are really only the international flows, domestic flows, and other finance from the private sector and domestic expenditures are not captured here. So this is only international finance flows. And on the right-hand side, the red arrow, doubling the adaptation finance from 2019 levels by 2025, as urged in the Glasgow Climate Pact, would only reduce the gap by another 5 to 10%. You know, it's still, whatever we look at, it's going to be impossible to breach or to narrow that gap significantly without additional sources of funding. And the report looked at ways by which the adaptation finance gap could be bridged further. Of course, in the center, increasing international public adaptation finance is critical. I mean, that's what the international negotiations are about. Enhancing domestic expenditure on adaptation is happening and will become more and more relevant as countries take adaptation and climate risks into account further. And then also the private sector finance is of critical relevance, but hard for us to determine as countries and the private sector are increasingly recognizing their own climate risks and also seeing opportunities for investing in solutions to address climate adaptation. So these are areas that need to grow, but in addition, there are four surrounding topics that I will talk briefly to. There's, on the one hand, remittances, that is what migrants living abroad return and send to families and friends in their countries, and this could be targeted towards adaptation. It can be very large in terms of the GDP component. Increasing finance specifically for small and medium-sized enterprises is also relevant because they tend to be the backbone of the private sector in many developing countries, and strengthening their capacity to deal with climate risks would definitely improve the ability of countries to reduce their climate risks. Then a reform of the financial architecture, the global financial architecture, for instance, as envisioned by the Bridgetown Initiative, would improve the way by which adaptation and climate change are included in the main financial organizations that we're dealing with, and that could address issues related to national debt due to large climate impacts, for instance. And then lastly, implementing Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement to align low carbon climate resilient development is also very important in this context. So standard setting organizations that oversee, for instance, engineering, design, insurance, and lending practices are also moving towards incorporating climate science into their benchmarking and requirements and guidelines. And this is already supporting the implementation of Article 2 through standardization of reports, signals to the financial industry and the real economy, and then cascading down to the multilateral development banks to align with the Paris methodologies and other partners. So these are ways by which the Article 2.1c could be implemented at the international level. So I'll stop here. Thank you for listening, and hope you have some questions. I hope that I will be able to answer them. Thank you. Back to you,
Thank you,
Nintendo.
Henry. Thank you, Henry. And is there anyone has quick question for Henry's presentation? I will open one question for quick one. Anyone? Okay, so everyone save the questions for the question and answer part. Thank you again, Henry. And our last but best presentation will be transformational adaptation, locally led adaptation, and the global goal on adaptation. Our speaker will be Elizabeth Gilmore. She is the co-chair of Working Group on Global Goal on Adaptation of World Adaptation Science Program. And Dr. Elizabeth Gilmore is an associate professor in environmental engineering and the School of Public Policy and Administration at the Carleton University, Ottawa, Canada. And she's also a special science advisor at the Environment and Climate Change Canada. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who integrates quantitative and qualitative methods to understand the dynamics of environmental hazards, socioeconomic and political factors, and climate adaptation. She was the author of the summary for policymaker for Working Group 2 in the 6th assessment of the IPCC. Now she are going to give us a very good presentation on transformation adaptation. Now the floor is yours, Elizabeth. Do you want me to share the screen or you would? Okay, you will do it yourself. Thank you very much.
Good morning, or good afternoon, and good evening. Okay, so something just to be clear, you can see the screen that I'm sharing. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just going to take a minute just to situate myself with the Zoom. Because
Yeah, we can see the
Okay.
screen.
Okay, I think it may just be at my end that something doesn't look quite right. So please just bear with me for 1 second. Hold My apologies.
Do you need any help? Maybe I can share the screen for
No,
you.
I think I'm fine. I think unfortunately my machine
Okay.
was a bit slow because I had too much open.
Okay.
So thank you. Thank you everyone for your patience. So as introduced, and thank you for that kind introduction. My name is Elizabeth Gilmore. I'm joining you today from Ottawa, Canada. I'm going to be presenting on sort of one more activity that the World Science Adaptation Program has been engaged in. And specifically, I'm presenting on behalf of our working group on the global goal on adaptation. So the World Adaptation Science Program has been engaged, like many other groups, with thinking about the global goal on adaptation, and specifically within the role of WASP as helping to translate science into some of the policy arenas. And so I'd like to just start by highlighting some of the previous work that WASP has produced, specifically a science brief, a science policy brief related to the global goal that came out prior to COP28. And really, this is to just sort of remind us of sort of where we've been and also kind of where we're going with this. The types of I am so sorry. I really worry I'm having some sort of technical issue with my machine.
Okay, Elizabeth, can you maybe?
Can you still see this?
Yes, I can see
okay.
the
I'm so sorry.
the state of GGA.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the global goal was established in the Paris Agreement, and it was described as enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change, with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal. Since then, we've sort of seen a flurry of activity. First, related to the many parts that could be understood to be part of the GGA. And so the original briefs really sort of started, sort of prior to, to the COP28, thinking about metrics, indicators, and context. Now, we've come out of COP28 really with sort of the beginning of the GGA framework. So I think a lot of us had been largely focused on sort of metrics and indicators, focusing on thinking about what sort of, how metrics and indicators should be linked to outcomes. I think what COP28 really provided us was a sense of what it is that we're going to be looking at within the GGA. And so specifically looking at impacts, vulnerability, and risk assessment, looking at planning, looking at implementation, and looking at monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And so each one of these really kind of outlines, specific goals, but it still has not really gotten to metrics and indicators. So it's kind of left us still thinking about what the most appropriate ways are to really get a handle now on these 4 framework goals. And so this was then also recognized within the decision text, right? So the decision text along the lines of this framework said, let's establish a 2-year work program for identifying the need for developing as well as existing metrics and indicators that can measure the progress identified along this framework. And so the World Adaptation Science Program, through its GGA efforts, is now also turning attention to this area. I'm also going to highlight within this talk, because I think it really becomes coupled very quickly, which was that the text also communicated a need to better understand transformational adaptation. And so we're also looking at that somewhat concurrently. Within this, we have previously identified, and the empirical evidence is really there, that locally led adaptation and its priorities really need to be foregrounded in an effective GGA. And so some key entry points are, in fact, looking for approaches that ensure that local priorities are articulated and foregrounded, even in the defining of effectiveness. And we can think about this, inclusive of issues like gender equity and ensuring livelihoods. I think it's also about not just articulating these priorities and foregrounding locally led adaptation within a GGA context, but also thinking about how to identify metrics and indicators that are important for local communities and also are transformational. And I'll come back to that point. And then, of course, addressing some of the issues and trade-offs of capacities and opportunities for streamlining metrics and monitoring. I think we say this a lot, but I think it is worth reminding ourselves just how critical adaptation is in reducing a wide range of risks. These are the burning embers that come from IPCC Working Group 2 approaches, looking at temperature, looking at risk, and then further looking at adaptation along these dimensions, at different temperature levels with different levels of adaptation. So maybe even just focusing in on heat-related morbidity and mortality, you can see it with, global surface temperatures, right? So here we have sort of the gray band around 1, which is where we are now, 1.5 and up to 2. And proactive adaptation can really go a long way to reducing expected risks. And so globally, within a context of a GGA, we really do have evidence that we're thinking of, and reasons to really think about this, not just in its parts, but also the sum over the many the many ways that we'll be looking to reduce heat-related morbidity, mortality, and then mortality over a wide range of outcomes. Now, I think while we see this within a lot of the modeling results, also within Working Group 2, we did find when we really drilled down into these indicators of effectiveness and risk reduction, right? So while we have this overall evidence that adaptation will be able to help us reduce risk really at any temperature, but also within the temperature ranges within the Paris Agreement, looking at these indicators, we see a couple things, right? First, when we looked at sort of a systematic assessment of adaptation responses as reported in academic literature, right, we did see indications and indicators that would allow us to capture effectiveness and risk reduction, but also that the evidence was not was more difficult to capture than you would expect, given how we understand the capacity for adaptation. So I think what that's setting up is a little bit of a tension. We know it reduces risk, but empirically, how we link that to indicators can actually be a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more challenging at times. Really what we find is that it's really the combination of approaches that will ultimately provide the most comprehensive picture, but it then would be available from any single approach, but also each of these brings in its own, their own sets of assumptions, right? So those that might come from countries or from official government documents may also not be capturing or be as inclusive of all aspects. Similarly, information from private sector, maybe only capturing the priorities of those areas. And so perhaps a little bit similar to the discussion that Henry brought up, it also is about whose evidence is coming into play and how we are sort of trying to leverage that, but also looking for how this influences some of the interpretation that we presently have available. Now, sort of moving from that, though, I think that we have some strong basis as a point of departure for anything that would start to engage with indicators in their form of accessing, enabling, and accelerating and sustaining adaptation. And so really what this becomes a process in is focusing the assessment of needs really in a way that's linked to desirable outcomes. So thinking about effectiveness, thinking about process, thinking about finance, and thinking about governance. I think what's also very clear, though, from our previous analyses and really what comes out of Working Group 2 is the need to adopt approaches that really stress that we need flexibility and that we need a wide range of options. Now, you see this within the GGA framework in that, they really sort of focused on these very broad, they didn't sort of prescribe exactly what it is we need to do or even how it is we need to do it. But in the selection of indicators and metrics, we need to continue to have this reflected. And then finally, it can really be about identifying. So I know the notes around developing, but it may also be about identifying acceptable and simple to measure indicators. And all of these flow from the IPCC findings, but I think are worth bringing back when we start a discussion here about GGA metrics and indicators, really in any context. Now, I think the other thing that we've been thinking about in our working group is also to what extent does indicators of success also help us to anticipate and monitor risks? Adaptation, when done effectively, right? So essentially what we call adaptation, which we've understood to be a process that reduces risks. We've also have more evidence than not about the risks of maladaptation. And while there's a number of ways that these processes occur, it may not also be that indicators that track effective adaptation will necessarily also capture risks of maladaptation or allow us to identify that at early stages. And so here, I think it's really about also carefully monitoring these risks along other, key dimensions, but thinking about them in ways that we have to think about, are the dimensions and indicators that make responses, what are the ones that make responses more successful, but also how, whether just simply scoring low on any given indicator is the same as avoiding maladaptation. And I think that's a question that we may want to spend some time on, and we'd be excited to learn about what people are thinking in this area. So, the GGA framework itself, while it lays out a number of clear goals, we also note in the decision text that there's a request to learn more about transformational adaptation. And, sort of transformational and sometimes, alternatively transformative adaptation. From the Working Group 2 report, it was quite clear that as we went through and did a systematic review of the literature, that along a number of dimensions that we would consider to be transformational, that the efforts are insufficient to meet expected climate risks. But when we think about transformational or transformative, our thinking is also that you really need to drill down into that aspect in order to ensure that this is really built in and understand how it could inform GGA indicators. I think, we've touched on this point before, but I think it's important to bring it back, which is about the co-development of adaptation and development. And so here, some of this could come in a long process, transparency and inclusive participatory methodologies, stressing gender and other elements of social equity. And here we had built out an example around agroecological methods that use participatory processes and co-creation of knowledge that can help address inequities. And in that way, that is transformational or transformative. It's also about identifying where some of the research needs still lie. Right, so this is, specifically on ways to support these approaches at scale, along with interactions with non-climate policy and markets. And so here, for example, it's in the Working Group 2 report, we identified the need to have additional evidence related to effective policies and how they address not just the risk from climate hazards, but really drilling into risks on vulnerability. And so I think the call here, as we think about the transformational aspect, is to really look at how adaptation and development co-evolve and have this somehow also reflected within the things that we're measuring. It's also, transformational adaptation is also about thinking about processes of governance. Here we're highlighting governance for sustained assessments within adaptation, thinking about not just how to, in ways where knowledge production standards, reporting, and priorities are revisited in a sustained, over a sustained period of time. And thinking about this in terms of clear goals, priorities, and defined responsibilities, thinking about this as far as inclusive governance. So again, really prioritizing equity and justice with a center on direct participation. And then finally, the political commitment and follow through that's really needed across all levels of governance. And so for transformational adaptation to really be seen within the GGA, these are the types of aspects of governance that we would want to be bringing to the forefront. I think finally, it's about transformational or transformative adaptation really being about the shift from thinking about a number of dimensions, which Working Group 2, which we understood within the framework of climate resilient development. And so thinking about processes that generate low levels of climate resilient development, here we're thinking about processes that engage with our singular knowledge systems, ecosystem degradation, exclusion, inequity, and injustice. And so really in that way, transformational adaptation is really about shifting us to these higher levels of climate resilient development that become accessible to us by foregrounding knowledge diversity, ecosystem sustainability, equity, justice, and inclusion. And so what this really brings us to right now within the World Adaptation Science Program and our considerations around GGA, and importantly, the aspects on locally led adaptation, is first, kind of thinking about what are and how to address these barriers, or barriers as they may exist, to inclusive participation. So really coming back to local priorities being articulated and foregrounded. Asking questions about what's needed for how to measure and collect what matters. So I think, I spoke a little bit earlier, and it will, continue to kind of be at play, issues and trade-offs of capacity and opportunities for how to streamline this in a way that we still collect what matters. But I think really where we're most interested in sort of listening and learning to ensure that within the capacity that the World Adaptation Science Program has, that our policy briefs can also reflect sort of where there may be some opportunities to think about how to couple process, implementation, and M&E. Here, for example, we've been thinking about how to identify non-conventional metrics, metrics that may be in M&E evaluation and learning within those mechanisms, how to better bring qualitative data into quantified frameworks, ideas that we can learn from lesson learned documents. As well as to think about how to overcome barriers themselves as indicators of progress in the process of adaptation. And I think what we're thinking here is that often we would treat that only as a process. It's treated sort of so much as sort of just an indication of progress, of a process, but rather reframing it as an indicator of progress itself. So I'm going to end there, and thank you so much for the opportunity to present to this group.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your excellent presentation. Now I will open the question and answer session. And anyone who are going to ask questions, please introduce yourself, where you're from, which your institution, and tell us which speaker will your question go to. Okay, any question from the audience? Okay. Since there is no questions from the floor or from the audience, maybe I can ask a question for our three excellent speakers, and then we'll have a short panel discussion. So my question is for your three, and as we all know, the Gobeshona conference have a focus of locally led adaptation. So actually, the presentation from Prabhakar and Elizabeth also mentioned the locally led adaptation a little bit more or less. So my question is, what are the challenges and the solutions for enhancing the effectiveness of locally led adaptation action? So I think that discussion will be important for our the conference. So who will answer this question first? I will repeat it. What are the challenges and solutions in your view for enhancing the effectiveness of locally led adaptation action? So maybe we can have a short panel discussion on this question. So who will
Okay, so
have
I'll go first. If you,
thank you.
yeah, thank you. So thank you for that very interesting question, Minpeng. I see that the locally led adaptation can be differentiated from other adaptation approaches. For example, technically driven, projects funded by like ADB, World Bank. They have a very structured view to the project implementation. Like you first go and do risk and vulnerability assessments, and then have a single measure in view. For example, building a dike, or putting a canal wall or something like that. So those projects are differentiated by the locally led adaptation projects, where the issues are identified bottom up and the solutions are identified bottom up. So there are two spectrums of these different approaches available, and I see that a lot of structured knowledge and structured tools are available for the first kinds of the projects. For example, projects funded by ADB or World Bank, which have a very rigid frameworks and implementation mechanisms. But when it comes to the locally led adaptation, they demand a lot of flexibility in the way the projects are designed and in the way the projects are implemented, monitored, and evaluated. And probably because of this, it also brings an element of uncertainty. The more uncertainty in the outcomes, than probably, because the donors, like in the case of the technically driven, technocratically driven projects, they tend to demand certain expected outcomes much rigidly. That's what my understanding is, compared to organic nature of the local adaptation projects. So I think the first problem is how the donors will be able to capture what are the expected outcomes the project can bring out. And also there is another angle of equity, fairness, and justice elements. There has been a lot of debate about the locally led and participatory adaptation can enhance justice and equity elements within the projects, but we have not seen a lot of evidence for that. We try to review a lot of community-based and locally led adaptation projects, but when we try to ask specific questions, that who took the decision and how transparent those decisions and things like that, which are related to equity and justice elements, we received a very limited evidence for that. That there is a full transparency, that there is a full and equitable sharing of the benefits of the project and things like that. There is still a certain agency involved in these projects. So I think we need to bring out some of these evidences much more clearly, so that we can say for sure that locally led adaptation projects can contribute to these justice and equity elements in the future as well. The third element I would say is that the financing. We are seeing the financing as both as a carrot as well as a stick. Looking at the COP28 discussions, I increasingly feel that international institutions want to use financing as both as a carrot and stick, and that could actually really curtail the potential and the innovativeness of the locally led adaptation projects can bring in, which demand for organic nature and bottom-up process. So I really hope that my understanding is wrong, and that these international organizations really don't want to use the financing as a carrot and stick approach, to even to facilitate the more locally led adaptation projects as well. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhakar, and I totally agree with you that maybe the current financial system maybe a little bit too rigid for the locally led actions, and of course we have a lot of things to do. So maybe Henry, are you ready for share with us your reflection on this question? Okay.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, Prabhakar touched upon so much. There isn't a whole lot of additional things I can say. I guess what I would say is that for me, locally led adaptation is primarily something that is driven by local communities or indigenous people affected by the impacts of climate change, whether that is now crowdsourced or the funding comes from global or national institutions, is not so much the point for me as is that these organizations are intimately involved in the development of these proposals and projects and their implementation and execution.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they have a leadership role here. They have ownership. They have the agency to determine the direction of the action that is going forward. And I think that is critical to making adaptation action more sustainable, both in environmental, economic, and social dimensions. So I think that this is the key element for me for locally led adaptation, and is a requirement. And really, we have evidence that it is much more effective. You know, here I come back to the term of effectiveness than other solutions that are imposed and that do not have this local buy-in. Another element that I think is really critical and I think is not being acknowledged sufficiently, and I'll stop after that, is looking into the future. I mean, this requires the capacity to assess not only what is currently happening in terms of climate impacts, but looking beyond that and taking into account that climate is changing and that the conditions under which the adaptation needs to take place has to also address future climate risks. And that is something that is not happening from our assessment in last year's, not last year's, but the 2022 Adaptation Gap Report. We looked at adaptation effectiveness specifically, and one of our conclusions was that, you know, the elements that address the future are not acknowledged in pretty much any adaptation projects, not even the most relevant and best adaptation projects that we could find. So this is something where there is improvement possibilities. Thanks. I'll just hand it over to Elizabeth for some more final words.
Elizabeth,
Well,
the floor is yours.
yeah, thank you. I mean, thank you, Prabhakar. Thank you, Henry. You know, I think, I mean, I see a couple sort of maybe just things to add. You know, I think a lot of the key points here, you know, again, sort of, I think we've touched upon. I think where we may want to come back to the one is thinking a little bit about, you know, about finance. So as the GGA continues to be built out, right, the hope is that sort of that the crystal ball of what this is going to be will become increasingly clear. But finance really, I mean, that will end up being one of the most challenging aspects here. It was not really articulated yet. And certainly from everything we know about these processes, that will end up being one of the very most challenging parts. And I think here, right, it's, you know, I think the evidence for the effectiveness of locally led adaptation, of ownership, you know, I think that it's quite clear how important this is. But I think ensuring that it's really in and not out is a much more of GGA and hence of whatever finance arrangements are made, I think has to also be understood in terms of why we need why locally led adaptation exists, and also perhaps why it is more effective than other alternatives, right? So I think here we have to be really cognizant of processes of co-option, right? If we have certain structures in certain ways, these very processes of ownership may end up no longer working in the ways that they need to in order to have this effectiveness. So I think there's a really important interplay there. But also, as much as we talk about agency and ownership, we also have to think about those clearly delineated responsibilities. Processes that would also create a real opting out. Right, making people who are incredibly, for whom locally led adaptation is the most pressing and is the most needed. If you have structures that effectively lock them out or require them to opt out in order to preserve that, it's effectively making people, it's putting all the responsibility onto local communities and not giving them access to the GGA. So I think here, I think that there's both the ways in which this is going to come together, but also recognizing that that some of the exact reasons why locally led adaptation exists and why it works is also potentially at risk within this process. And I think it's really important that we watch that. I think perhaps some of the calls to consider not just sort of small maladaptation, but some of the larger processes around that could be a helpful, potentially a helpful framing. I think also in that way, it is about articulating both the future for risk reduction, but also the importance of co-benefits and development. Because that's really what transformational adaptation tries to do. And in that way, really try to shift some of the structures that create some of these issues in the first place. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that's, we all agree that innovative adaptation finance will be necessary for locally led action as well. So actually we did get a question from our audience. It's from Jamie Williams. His question is, what are the implications that locally led adaptation was recognized for the first time in a COP decision text? Decision 7 CMA 5 para 14. So Henry, Prabhakar, and Elizabeth, who of you are willing to answer this question?
Okay, I will go first.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's. I would say it's. I'm a little bit pessimist, not so much optimist from the point of view of a single word in a multiple page document signifies anything, but it at least signifies to the extent that it's a win for the community of the locally led adaptation to have their experience and evidence voiced and reflected in the text of a global negotiation of the nature. So that's that I will give it to them. Okay, but beyond that, locally led adaptation, we have been hearing about this for the past 10 years, the word locally led adaptation. And before that, we have the community-based adaptation, which was championed by Professor Salimul Haq. And I would say that really what ICAD has done in that area is phenomenal. And one important contribution of this area is they have brought the learning as an outcome of a project. Before the community-based adaptation, before LLA, I have not read so many papers in a technocratically driven project that learning could be an outcome. Okay, but now we can confidently say that what are the learnings of a project. Forget about the income and equity justice, but there is certain amount of learning that has happened, and I think some of these elements will continue to receive attention, and they will bolster the community-based and the locally led adaptation as we move forward. I would not give too much emphasis to whether or not it was mentioned in a globally negotiated text, but even before mentioning, they have been doing phenomenal work. I think they will continue to do that, and we only need to see some kind of empirical analysis coming out. Okay, since that it is mentioned one phrase in the entire so many number of pages document, has it really increased the funding for LLA, for example, in the years to come? I would really be very pessimistic in that area, but I would love to be disproved in that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Prabhakar. Any supplementary comments from Harry and Elizabeth?
Well,
Okay.
I mean,
Okay, Harry, the floor
I'll
is
be very
yours.
quick. I can second Prabhakar here. I don't know what is going to come out of the fact that it's mentioned in the decision text now, but it's in the negotiations, and that in itself means something. It might be symbolic at this point, because the locally led adaptation is also mal-defined. It's not clear what it means, but it could then find its way into the indicators that are being discussed in the Global Goal on Adaptation framework. It could find its way into nationally led adaptation and nationally determined contributions and the NAPs. So where it finds its way into these policy relevant documents at national level, that's where it becomes something that's tangible and can be measured against. And then that's where we'll see the progress going forward. So, you know, this is how the negotiations and the convention works. You know, it's in the text. That means it will now be more frequently be addressed in these national policy documents and planning instruments. And from there, we have an instrument to track and monitor it over time. And then we'll see how it plays out, you know, in terms of the evaluation and learning that happens irrespectively with hindsight.
Okay, thank you, Harry. And now, is there any other questions from the audience? Okay, since there is no further questions regarding our three presentations, the session will close. And thanks all the three excellent presenters and your presentations. Special thanks will go to Prabhakar because it's his middle night, and thank you. It's quite challenging for him to give the presentation. And also, we thank you all, the team and all the organizer for the excellent conference and sessions. Thank you for all your support. And also, I would like to thank Yin, who had done a lot of work for preparing this session. Thank you all, and we are looking forward to further discussion and communication in future. Okay, I will stop here and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Minping. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Manishika, bye-bye.